He's the most recognizable scientist in human history. The wild hair, the equation, the face plastered on 1,000,000 dorm room walls. Albert Einstein. We think we know him. His story is one of the most repeated in Western culture. A Jewish physicist from Germany who fled the Nazis, reinvented physics, and became a secular saint of human intelligence. But in 2022, a team of genealogical researchers, cross-referencing European civil records with newly submitted DNA samples from Einstein's known descendants, uncovered something that didn't fit the official biography. Not one thing, several. And the deeper they looked, the stranger it got. The accepted story begins in Ulm, Germany, in 1879. Albert Einstein was born to Hermann Einstein and Pauline Koch, both from Ashkenazi Jewish families with roots in the Swabian region of southwestern Germany. The family was secular, educated, and middle class. Hermann ran a small electrical equipment business. Pauline was musical and intellectually ambitious. Albert grew up in Munich, struggled with the rigid educational system, relocated to Switzerland, and by 1905, while working as a patent clerk in Bern, published 4 papers that would permanently alter the course of physics: the photoelectric effect, Brownian motion, special relativity, and the relationship between mass and energy that produced the most famous equation ever written. In a single year, working alone, in his spare time, he reshaped the foundations of modern science. The Jewish identity was central to Einstein's life story. During the rise of National Socialism, Nazi propaganda specifically targeted him. His work was denounced as Jewish physics. When Hitler came to power in 1933, Einstein was in the United States. He never returned to Germany. He became a vocal advocate for Jewish refugees, supported the Zionist movement, and was even offered and declined the presidency of Israel in 1952. His heritage wasn't incidental to his biography. It was woven into every chapter of it. The identity that made him a target also made him a symbol of resilience, of intellectual freedom, of everything the Nazi project sought to destroy. That connection between his science and his heritage became inseparable in the public imagination. So when genealogist Dr. Raphael Meyer, working with the German Jewish Genealogical Society in Frankfurt, began compiling a full ancestral database for the Einstein family in 2019, no one expected complications. The project was intended as a tribute, a complete family tree for one of history's great figures, supplemented by voluntary DNA submissions from verified descendants of Einstein's sons, Hans Albert and Eduard. It was meant to be a confirmation exercise. Document what was already known. Add genetic data to support it. Close the file. The mitochondrial line, Einstein's maternal ancestry, came back clean. Pauline Koch's family traced clearly through Ashkenazi Jewish populations with origins in southern Germany and Alsace. The genetic markers matched exactly what the documentary record predicted. Centuries of endogamous Jewish community life in the Rhine Valley, consistent with historical settlement patterns dating to the medieval period. Every data point aligned. The maternal line was exactly what the biography said it was. But when researchers mapped the Y chromosome, the paternal line passed from father to son, generation to generation. Something unexpected appeared. The haplogroup was consistent with Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry at the broad level. However, specific subclade markers pointed toward a lineage distribution that concentrated not in Germany or Central Europe, but in a corridor stretching from northern Italy through the alpine regions into what is now Austria and Switzerland, a genetic signature associated with populations that had migrated through that region long before the Jewish communities of the Rhineland were established. It wasn't a dramatic divergence. It wasn't a foreign haplogroup or a surprise ethnicity. It was subtler than that. A cluster of markers pointing in a direction that the documentary record had never suggested. A direction that raised more questions than the research had been designed to answer. Meyer's team went back to the documentary record. Hermann Einstein's father was Abraham Einstein, born in Buchau am Federsee in 1808. Abraham's father was Raphael Einstein, born around 1780 in the same town. Buchau had maintained a small but continuous Jewish community since at least the 17th century. The records there were unusually well preserved, and they showed something the family biography had never addressed. Raphael Einstein's own father appeared in the records under a slightly different surname spelling, and his place of birth was listed not as Buchau, but as a village across the border in what is now the Italian Tyrol. That single detail, a birthplace entry, a spelling variation, a village on the other side of a mountain range, was easy to overlook. For generations, no one had looked closely enough to notice it. The Einstein name was documented in Buchau. The community was established. The family was known. There was no reason to look further back. But the DNA had pointed in exactly that direction, and now the archive was pointing there too. The Italian Tyrol in the late 18th century was a complex ethnic and religious mosaic. German-speaking communities, Latin-speaking alpine populations, and long-settled Jewish merchant families all coexisted in the region. Jewish families in that area often maintained commercial networks connecting them to both the German states to the north and the Italian city-states to the south. Cross-border migration was common, and surnames shifted with dialect and record-keeping convention. A family could cross one mountain pass, settle in a new valley, and within 2 generations be recorded under a different spelling with no documented connection to where they came from. Administrative borders in that period were porous. Identity was practical. You were recorded as whatever the local clerk wrote down, in whatever language the local authority used that decade. What the DNA suggested, and what the archive in Buchau partially supported, was that the Einstein paternal line did not originate in the established Jewish communities of southwestern Germany. It traced, at least 1 generation further back than previously documented, to this alpine borderland. Whether the family had been in that region for 1 generation or many, the records could not confirm. The oldest legible entry for the Einstein name in that Italian Tyrolean village dated to the 1750s. Before that, nothing. The trail went cold in the Alps, 3 decades before Raphael Einstein was born, and it did not resume. Historian Dr. Leah Strauss at the University of Vienna, who specializes in Ashkenazi migration patterns, reviewed the findings. She noted that the genetic signature was not anomalous on its own. Ashkenazi populations show significant internal diversity, and the Alpine corridor has historically been a conduit for Jewish migration across centuries. But she flagged one detail as potentially significant. The specific subclade markers in the Einstein paternal sample appeared in a cluster that also showed up at low frequency in Sephardic Jewish populations from northern Italy, communities whose ancestors had been expelled from Spain in 1492 and resettled across the Italian peninsula and into the Alpine regions. To understand why that matters, you have to understand what 1492 actually meant for Jewish communities across Europe. When Spain issued the Alhambra Decree, an estimated 150,000 to 200,000 Jews were forced to leave the country within 4 months. They scattered across the Mediterranean, to the Ottoman Empire, to North Africa, to Portugal, and to the Italian city-states, which offered varying degrees of tolerance depending on the political climate of the moment. Communities formed in Venice, Ferrara, Genoa, and smaller northern Italian towns. They brought with them their language, Ladino, a form of medieval Spanish written in Hebrew script, their religious customs, their trade networks, and their surnames. For several generations, they maintained a distinct Sephardic identity, separate from the Ashkenazi communities of Central and Northern Europe. But over the following decades and centuries, some of those families moved again, north through Alpine trade routes, into communities that were culturally and religiously Ashkenazi, but geographically accessible from the Italian side of the Alps. The integration, when it happened, was total. Within a generation or two, the language shifted to German, the religious practice aligned with Ashkenazi custom, and the memory of Iberian origin faded entirely. Children grew up speaking German and knowing nothing of Spain. grandchildren had no living connection to the Ladino their great-grandparents had spoken. There was no scandal in it, no rupture. It was simply how populations moved and merged in early modern Europe. Communities absorbed one another quietly, over time, leaving no visible CM. If that connection held for the Einstein line, it would mean Einstein's paternal ancestry wasn't purely Ashkenazi in the conventional Central European sense. It would suggest a Sephardic branch, Spanish Jewish exiles who moved north through Italy, adopted German as a working language, integrated into Ashkenazi community structures over generations, and eventually became indistinguishable from the surrounding Jewish population in Swabia. The distinction mattered culturally and historically, even if in practical terms, by the 19th century, no one would have known the difference. Not even the family itself. The Sephardic origin, if it existed, would have been as invisible to Hermann and Pauline Einstein as it was to every biographer who came after them. But the research didn't stop at Einstein's paternal line. A separate strand of the investigation turned to the maternal ancestry of Mileva Maric, Einstein's first wife, and, by several historians' accounts, a significant intellectual collaborator during the most productive years of his career. She was Serbian, born in 1875 in what is now northern Serbia. She was the first woman to study physics at ETH Zurich, where she and Einstein met. She never received formal credit for contributions that some researchers believe were substantial. The question of her role in Einstein's early work remains one of the most debated topics in the history of science. Letters between them, written during their student years, show her engaging directly with the physics problems that would become his landmark 1905 papers. How much of that engagement shaped the final work is something historians have argued about for decades without resolution. DNA submitted by descendants of Maric's family line confirmed her documented Serbian Orthodox ancestry, but also flagged genetic markers associated with Central Asian populations, consistent with historical migration patterns across the Pannonian Plain during the medieval period. This wasn't surprising to specialists. Serbian and Hungarian populations in that region carry detectable traces of Avar, Cuman, and other steppe origin groups who settled in the Carpathian Basin over 1,000 years ago. These were nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples who arrived from the Eurasian steppe, established kingdoms and confederacies across the Hungarian plain, and eventually assimilated into the settled Christian populations around them, leaving genetic traces that persist to this day in the populations of southeastern Europe. Maric's DNA carried those traces, faint, ancient, consistent with the broader regional pattern, but present. It added another layer to the story of the world's most famous scientific partnership, two people whose genetic histories crossed continents and centuries, meeting in a lecture hall in Zurich, building ideas together that neither of them could have built alone, and leaving behind a legacy that only one of them received credit for. Einstein became a legend. Maric became a footnote. The DNA suggested that even her ancestry, like his, was more layered than any simple national identity could capture. The research was presented at a conference of the European Society for Genetic Genealogy in 2023. The reception was careful. Geneticists present emphasize that haplogroup distributions indicate population probability, not individual certainty. Without a direct sample from Einstein himself, his remains were cremated, and his brain, famously preserved and studied for decades, was eventually dissected, and confirmation of the specific subclade markers depended entirely on the integrity of the descendant samples and the accuracy of the genealogical chain connecting them. The findings were suggestive, they were not definitive. And that distinction matters. Science does not deal in certainty when the evidence is indirect. What it deals in is probability, consistency, and the accumulation of independent lines of evidence pointing in the same direction. And here, multiple independent lines pointed in the same direction. The Y chromosome markers, the archival birthplace entry in Bucau, the documented presence of Sephardic communities in northern Italy following 1492, the established historical pattern of alpine migration and community assimilation. None of these individually proved anything. Together, they outlined a coherent and plausible account of how a Sephardic Jewish family from Iberia could have become, over 3 centuries and several migrations, an Ashkenazi Jewish family in southwestern Germany with no surviving memory of the transformation. But suggestive evidence, when it aligns across multiple independent sources, genetic data, archival records, and historical migration patterns, tells a story worth taking seriously. History is full of celebrated ancestry narratives that turn out, when examined closely, to be layered with movements and migrations that the official story never captured. The Kennedys and their Norman ancestry, the countless aristocratic European families whose documented lineages conceal far older and more complex migrations. Einstein's Jewish identity was real and lived and consequential. His family faced persecution because of it. He built his public life around it. The suffering was real. The displacement was real. None of that changes. What the DNA adds is depth. It suggests that the roots of his family ran further and in more directions than any biography had accounted for, through alpine borderlands, through northern Italian merchant communities, possibly back to families who packed what they could carry, and left Spain in 1492 because they had no other choice. People who spent generations rebuilding in a new language, under a new cultural framework, until the original story was completely submerged, until all that remained was a Jewish family in a small German town, living quietly, running a business, raising children, carrying in their cells a memory they had no words for and no reason to suspect. Until one of those children sat in a patent office in Bern and rewrote the laws of the universe. Einstein once wrote that imagination was more important than knowledge. He might have appreciated the irony. The man who dismantled certainty in physics may himself be, genetically, more complicated than the story anyone told about him. The records are incomplete. The DNA is suggestive, not definitive. But the question it raises doesn't go away. The biography starts in Germany, but the bloodline tells a different story, one that begins centuries earlier and thousands of miles away.